Hey everybody, how you doing? Everybody's eyes are a little bit red today as compared to yesterday, we're noticing. Anyway, so the first thing we'll talk about is level range coverage. What we mean by this is when we started out designing World of Warcraft, we realized that something that makes an MMO a lot of fun for players is not feeling like they're funneled through content, like they only have one choice at one time. So when I talk about level range coverage, what I mean is that we also didn't want to start the dungeons off too early because it takes a little bit more organization to do a dungeon than it does the outdoor world. So our lowest level dungeon is Ragefire Chasm. One way to get people to go to dungeons to have some fun with our boss encounters is put really good loot there. We figured out that the experience in a dungeon is actually better than the outdoor world, but there are a few factors that come into play that make it more efficient to level up in the outdoor world. For example, you've got to get a group together to form up and even go to a dungeon. There's a travel time associated with getting to a dungeon. Dungeons require a much more tactical approach to combat. You don't just sort of smash through a field of boars, you know, doing thunderclap if you're the warrior, like, just aggro it all, I need XP. So kind of slow you down a little bit in dungeons. Our goal towards the Burning Crusade is to try to get back to where the experience feels meaningful in a dungeon. So when you're leveling up to 60 through 70, you don't just shoot to the end and then do the dungeons. We want you to do the dungeons as you level up. So that's something we're going to focus on for the Burning Crusade. Anyway, we want an epic feel and sense of danger. This usually happens in the form of bugs where like Mortal Strike's doing 4 times the damage than it's supposed to, but occasionally we put really dangerous bosses and achieve that. And even if you look at the background picture of Stratholme all burning and stuff, it feels pretty dangerous. Elite NPCs. So elite NPCs are why our dungeons work. When we started making World of Warcraft, the first thing we focused on was iterating on our outdoor world combat, like, you know, go kill boars in Westfall and all that kind of stuff. And we just kept iterating on the combat till it felt really fun. Like, am I pressing buttons enough of the time but not just mashing them? Getting that kind of fine-tuned balance on how does combat feel from a pacing standpoint. I don't know how many of you have ever taken a group of 5 out into an exterior zone and just sort of trounced over non-elite creatures, but it's ridiculous. You don't even get a chance to use your spells and abilities. So we came up with the concept of elite NPCs. They have better loot on them, more hit points, they do more damage, but it requires a group to sort of take them down in a lot of cases. And we did this so that the class dependencies would all play out. You know, the warrior needs that priest healing, and you might need crowd control and all these sorts of things. Players want a sense of progression in a dungeon. Basically, I like to use the dev mines as an example. As you start clearing through, the rooms change. You see the mast room where they're building the mast for the ships, and then you get down to the foundry where they, you know, pour all the stuff to smelt the cannons or whatever. You finally get to the very end, and you get that big grand reveal of the juggernaut, you know, the boat right at the end, and it gives players that sense of progression. We want to vary the points of interest, so seeing too much of the same thing is tedious. A good example of this, again, is Stratholme, where you have the whole section that's sort of clean and pristine, where the Scarlet Crusade is holed up, and they're sort of fighting back against the Scourge. Looks very different than the dead side with all the Warcraft 3 ziggurats and the burning houses. You'd think the houses like would burn out and just be ash after a while. It's like Pirates of the Caribbean, they're still going. Mix up the pulls. So by this, we mean that you want to fight different creatures as you go through the dungeon. And not just different looking models of creatures, but you want to fight, you know, casters. This guy's an AE caster. This guy's a warrior. This guy is a paladin type mob. Like, really mix up the combinations of the pulls. Have some AE pulls in there. Make groups move through a dungeon and let everyone in the party experience it. We really wanted to get that feel of a dungeon crawl going. We felt like we spent so much time putting a lot of story and lore into the dungeons, and our artists just make every little area look so cool. They slave over the details that it'd just be tragic to have a dungeon where everybody sits in a corner, then the one, cool guy gets to run out and, oh, I'm gonna shoot my bow, and you guys just sit here all night long, and I'll just keep bringing them to you. We don't think pulling is a bad or a broken mechanic. We just want you to sort of pick your puller for your group and then lead the group through the dungeon. So I think pulling is a great way for individual players to show a lot of skill, and you can combo with like hunters and rogues and do some really interesting stuff in dungeons. But at the same time, we want to make sure the priest who's like told to sit in the back gets to actually move through the dungeon and see all the cool rooms. So try to make every class shine. Everything from the normal pulls that lead up to the bosses, and including the bosses, we're always asking ourselves, what do the different classes have to do in this particular encounter? We always try to come up with sort of unique creatures and unique areas to let everybody's spell shine. Another example I used yesterday was in Dire Mall, in the West Wing, on the upper tier there's a bunch of undead stuff. And at first, when we were playtesting, we're like, well, this is pretty cool. The pulls feel fun and everything. But somebody brought up the point, well, let's try it with a druid now. So we swapped the priest out, and we put a druid in the group, and suddenly we couldn't beat the pulls. So what we decided that night as we were tuning the dungeon is, let's switch one of the undead creatures out for those fairy dragons that are up there. And that'll allow druids to now hibernate one. So that's something that we kind of have to work closely with the class designers. Everything that we do affects them, and everything they do affects us. We also felt like boss pacing is important. There's sort of only so long you can go without getting loot before you start getting cranky, and then suddenly, oh, I'm going link dead. I don't know what's causing it. And we've all seen that. Or, oh, my mom just got home. I have to AFK out. And it's like, if loot is dropping more frequently, we feel like that priest is more likely to stay logged in. So we're not afraid to go back and fix stuff, and we're the first to admit that, we make mistakes, so it happens. One of the things that I know I was most excited about when we first started working on the game was we decided to instance the dungeons. The number one reason, in my opinion, to instance a dungeon is to avoid the negative player collision that can occur. Even players who are on the same alliance, if they're going for the same thing and not in the same group, it gets very ugly. Everybody likes being out in the world and affecting what everybody else is doing, but there comes that part in your play experience where you just want to do a dungeon and you don't want to worry about stepping on other people's toes or competing with spawns. You want to have that really highly tailored, well-crafted gameplay experience. And we felt like instancing would sort of get around that. Another great thing is that the boss is always up. Imagine if we didn't instance Stratholme. How often would you see Baron Rivendare? Never, exactly. We can do highly scripted encounters like the Wailing Caverns Escort, where you take the druid through and he wakes Nerlax and you fight the big Murloc. You can't do that in a single player dungeon. Another example I like to bring up is that of locked doors. If we put a locked door in a dungeon, it sort of requires you to have an engineer, a blacksmith, or a rogue there, and that locked door is suddenly a true obstacle to you. But if we put that locked door out in the outside world and Corey comes along and unlocks it, well, too bad. The 3,000 other people on the server can come and just get through that locked door. Also lets us put traps and ambushes and that sort of thing. Because we know how much you guys love traps, like the crates in Stratholme. Dude, just no crate quest this run. We just want to farm legs. So we also put public areas in front of our dungeons. So like to use the dead mines as an example, there's that area with the undead, and there's a lot of caverns with miners that aren't instanced. We did this for a couple reasons to make the chance that you could run into other people. You could like duo or trio that front section and hook up with other people. Or there's some people who just don't want to go in the instance but sort of test the waters, and then there's like the Scarlet Monastery has that little vestibule before the 4 doors. And that's always fun on the PvP servers too. It's the unannounced battleground called the Scarlet Monastery public area. The Horde have an advantage because they're like not flagged, so they're all standing there blue, like, oh, come on, dude, just run in here. Just open the door. Micro dungeons. When you go into Northshire and you level up your first human and you have that little gold mine right there, or if you're an orc in the Valley of Trials and there's that mountain cave, or the crypts out in Duskwood, like the Ravenhill Cemetery, we call those micro dungeons. So those are public dungeons that are not instanced, and they're usually, most of the time, tuned for the solo player, because we want solo players to sort of be able to have a dungeon experience if they wanted it and not have to group up and go into the dungeon. So instance dungeons are kind of for groups, and then those dungeons, those little micro dungeons out in the world is our solution for solo players. I'll talk a little bit about dungeon caps, and by what I mean by this is like on Dire Maul, for example, we only let 5 people in the dungeon. In the beta, we didn't have any caps. So it was really cool watching 40 people try to take on Baron Rivendare and lose. I have screenshots of that too. and you know what it is? I actually watched, because in beta it was really interesting to watch, because we can jump around and sort of spy on what everybody's doing. And there was like this hardcore group of 5 people doing Stratholme, and they started at the same time as this other group doing, I think it was a 20-person group. Well, it's so hard to get 20 people to like pay attention and not spaz out in general. The 20 people took longer to clear the dungeon, and eventually they just wiped out and stopped. Whereas the 5 people, because they're all there paying attention, clearing their way through, did much better. And then, like I said, we watched 40 people wipe on Baron Rivendare. Now, in all fairness, I think like 3 of them charged, and then there's like the 37 standing back as the doors close. So we found that players, as much as they like to say they like the skill and the challenge and whatever, if there's good loot lying somewhere in the world, they will take the path of least resistance to get it. It's not bad to take the path of least resistance, but we need to do things as game developers to ensure that your play experience is as fun as possible. So when a dungeon cap is exceeded, the perception of the quality of the overall experience goes down. The number one example that jumps into my head when I talk about this bullet point is Upper Blackrock Spire. A lot of players think that Upper Blackrock Spire is not challenging enough. Man, our guild has done it 40 times, and I can fall asleep on the raid. It doesn't even matter anymore. And that's because the majority of people are doing it with 15 people. That dungeon was tuned, that Upper Blackrock Spire, what's his name, Emberseer, Pyro Guard Emberseer, from beyond that room on was tuned for 10 people only. And Pyro, the Emberseer fight was actually tuned for 5 people. I think it's one of the funnest fights ever with 5 people. With 15 people, it goes into that category of like, what the hell were they thinking? This, like, boom, everything's dead, and like, is that guy gonna bust out yet? Because, So it was our fault as developers for not putting the cap in the first place. We were just a little bit reluctant because we were coming from beta where the sky was the limit. So, it's really hard. You don't want to upset the community, but at the same time, sometimes it's actually for their own good in the long run. Nobody ever wants to nerf anything or take anything out that players know and love. But I think dungeon caps is one of those examples. We always hear the counter argument of, man, I want to play WoW however I want to play it. And if for me it's fun to show up with 39 of my friends, who are you to tell me otherwise? And all of these kind of things. I always think back to this day, one of our programmers came to me in beta and said, one of our programmers, he said, I did Wailing Caverns last night, and I just think that end fight goes too fast. I think you should give the boss more hit points. And I'm like, well, that's a level 22 boss, we don't want him that hard. You're supposed to beat it. It turns out that he was a level 29 paladin, and he was grouped with 20 people doing Wailing Caverns. And his whole impression, and his friends, because he played with his friends, Their impression was that Wailing Caverns was a crappy dungeon that wasn't tuned well. There's that obligation that if the game allows you to put more people in your group, you're going to do it. Any changes, even good ones, are perceived as scary or bad by the community as a whole. When we got ready to release Dire Maul to the community, we said that we were going to cap it at 5. And we got really mixed reviews on this. A lot of people were super excited by that. And then there was a lot of people who said, you know, you're breaking the game. We like hitting these things with 10. But I feel the end result is most people recognize that Dire Maul is tuned for the proper cap and actually plays out much better. Change is necessary in a living, breathing game such as World of Warcraft or any persistent online game. This applies to everything from game design to programming to art, everything that we're working on in WoW. You often see the criticism on the boards like, oh, they made us beta test this and we're paying for it or whatever. But that's not really true. We have to stop and look at what an MMO is. It's a totally different kind of game. You guys are part of the development process. This game is being built around you. We felt like the players had a need for a stepping stone dungeon between Upper Blackrock Spire and Molten Core. This was the community who asked us for it. We shift our development priorities around and made Zul'Gurub a 20-man raid zone. That was purely because the community said this is something that we need in our game. The game is yours too, and if you say, you know, Scholomance really sucks, nobody likes to do it, guess what? We're grouping up on the live realms with our actual characters. All right, tonight we're going to analyze everything that's wrong with Scholomance and go back and change it. So the game is going to change, and it's changing because we're all part of the game development of World of Warcraft as a community and as a development team. We all kind of want to work together and bring the game up together, you know, as something that we're building. It's going to change for better or for worse, hopefully more for better. So we've learned a lot, mostly never to read the forum. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, I want to just get something out here right away. Speaking of the forums, we only read threads that either have our names in all caps or that say blue, respond blue. That's the only way we ever read a thread. Otherwise, we're like, what are these guys talking about? They're just posting craziness. Okay, so dungeons need tight level ranges. Early on, when we were building World of Warcraft and our combat system, we had no way of scaling difficulty. So in order to make a boss more difficult, we used to have to raise his level up. Van Cleef is 22 in the Deadmines, while the front creatures in the Deadmines are level 15. But it doesn't really work in the end. I mean, it's still a very fun dungeon and we love it, but we learned a lot of lessons from that. What we came away with from the Deadmines example is that winged dungeons allow players to define their play experience. We always come back to the monastery on this. So if I'm level 30 and I show up at the Scarlet Monastery, I have no chance of beating Mograine and Whitemane in the Cathedral. There's just no way I'm going to beat them. But I have a very good chance of having success in the Graveyard Wing. So Monastery lets players define what they want to do, like casual and hardcore is another example. If I only have like 40 minutes to play at night, I can go and I can do one wing of the Monastery. Conversely, if I'm the type that's playing like 14 hours a day and I want to cycle through every wing of the Monastery, I can do it and have it feel like a cohesive dungeon experience. So for each level range, a dungeon serves a different purpose. Level up dungeons, and by that I mean a dungeon from 1 to 59, let's say, serves a very different purpose than an endgame dungeon. Most players on what I call a level up dungeon go there once or maybe twice. They don't want to spend a lot of time doing the dungeon over and over again. In fact, they get resentful if they feel like they have to do the dungeon over and over again. Whereas an endgame dungeon, such as, let's say, Blackrock Spire or Stratholme, Dire Maul, Scholomance, one of those need to be compelling to players many different times. They're going to want to do those over and over to get the different loot. The loot now is loot that they're going to keep on their character for a much longer time than like Shadowfang loot. So knowing this, it really helps us when we're making expansion dungeons. Hellfire Citadel is one of our sort of lower level dungeons, lower level being like 60 something, but lower level dungeons in the expansion versus like Tempest Keep, which is an end game dungeon. Even the size and the scope of Hellfire Citadel can be a little bit smaller and a little bit more doable in one night, versus Tempest Keep has to have a lot of replay value there because that's where players are going to be for a long time.